and welcome to Season 4 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected, where we share the interesting and inspiring stories of artists, critical thinkers, thought leaders, and art professionals on a wide range of topics about life, work, society, success, failure, and the ways in which we navigate the journey. We share ideas on our inspirations and the influences that affect our lives. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and I look forward to sharing the conversations that I have with artists and creative professionals across the art industry and beyond. As I travel to art fairs, gallery openings, and events within the creative industries both in the U.S. and abroad, join me in discovering and learning about some of today's most interesting and dynamic artists and creative professionals. If you're new to the show, I'm happy to have you here. If you've been on this journey with me, welcome back. Let's get it. On this episode, I'm joined by Genevieve Gaignard as we discuss her latest exhibition and third solo show with Vilmeter Los Angeles, Thinking Out Loud. In the show, Gaignard excavates concepts of identity and reflects on the intersections of life's journey. In what might be her most intimate body of work to date, Thinking Out Loud overlaps her practice with some of her most recent lived experiences, set against the backdrop of her newly situated life in New York, where she has a new studio space. Her symbol-laden cryptic work speaks to larger truths: the building and breaking down of walls, the rupture of domesticity as wallpaper tears, and the experiences of everyday life that we must all work our way through. Gaignard explores the veil as armor, representing protection while moving through growth. She has described her work as a lived playlist, a diaristic processing of my life, a creative vibe set against the backdrop of mixtapes and personal soundtracks that transcends, romanticizes, and provides an escape from the everyday. Let's dive into my next episode with Genevieve Gaignard.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Gaignard, an artist, and we're here to talk about my show, Thinking Out Loud.
Genevieve, so happy to have you join me on an episode of Everything is Connected. Really looking forward to chatting with you today. We'll jump in with the first question. The first paragraph in the press release for your third solo exhibition with Vilmeter Los Angeles reads, "Genevieve Gaignard is haunted. We all are." Let's jump in right there and unpack that statement. What's happening in this show, Thinking Out Loud? And how are you investigating elements of your own hauntedness in the show?
So the idea of this kind of haunting that not only me, but we all kind of experience is to speak to the baggage we carry based on the relationships we have throughout our lives with family, friends, and loved ones. So the show is really excavating the deeper concerns I had within my relationships across the board. It started about 2 years ago, and I really wanted to look inward on some things that I felt like I had these patterns that had developed over time, thinking about how I showed up for people in my life and how they show up. The work is me understanding the habits that we build up over time in the ways we treat others and the way we allow others to treat us. I wanted to create a show that pointed at the personal or staged the personal as a way to speak to the audience. Or the connecting thing is that we all are going through something personal or multiple things at once that are very personal. My work overall has been this kind of journey to figure out where I belong in the world. The vintage wallpaper shows up in my photography. It shows up in my collage practice. I feel like this show, I've developed a deeper connection to those materials, and I wanted to push myself within my collage practice to really dig at some deeper topics that I might not have touched on in the past.
Yeah, I love that. We can definitely get into that a little bit later. When we talk about some specific works, but I'd like to switch over and talk a little bit about the Vilmeter space. It's very industrial in the building that it's in, and there's several galleries that Vilmeter showcases work within. I wanted to ask, how were you considering the site specificity of the space in creating this show, because there are elements with your clouds and the way the paintings are placed inside a part of the wall that's painted. There's the grass that you have on the bottom. There's these elements that are very immersive and bring you into an environment. How are you thinking about that with this particular show?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that in my practice in general across the board. I love to transform the space so that the viewer can like more immediately kind of tune into what's happening in the work and not think about being in a gallery space. The Vilmeter space is quite industrial and large, and I tend to be drawn to like more intimate or more home setting, if you will. And so I embrace the challenge of how I can transform that space, which is a little outside of what I would typically do. I chose to bring the outside inside. And although the idea is that you're inside of something smaller, the feel is that your head is in the clouds. You're walking through this space to be in a more relaxed mindset.
How involved are you in the hang of your work for a new exhibition? How do the design choices get made, and how does the location play a role in how you showcase your work?
I'm very involved in all of those things. The gallery is very helpful in terms of sharing specs and how the space looks and sending me a model of the space. The big decisions get made in terms of maybe what gets painted and where things kind of land. I was really excited to incorporate a bench around one of the pillars in that space just to create a more inviting area for people to really just sit and take in the work.
I've seen a few shows in general where an artist makes a very intentional decision to either have a bench fabricated, or they'll say, let's just put a bench here. And while it may seem like a very small, casual thing, it actually really isn't. And I think it's such an intentional and thoughtful choice about one's ability to just sit and look and observe and take it in, and also slow down, which is very different than the way that we move in the modern world that we live in. Everything is very fast paced. There's a sense of always wanting to be on the go, always checking your phone, the next notification, the next call, the next thing, and being able to sit with work and just sit in general and not feel pressed to do things and not feel pressed for time. It just also brings up all of these other things that have nothing to do with the work, but really do impact how one is experiencing life.
Yeah, it brings you somewhere else, but also grounds you in the moment of the thing that you're looking at. And even down to the color palette, I use this angelic blue. Some colors make you want to move through something faster and like, get in there and go. And then this one's like almost holding your hand to be like, it's cool.
Could you talk a little bit more about what's been inspiring you lately? And what are some of the things that drew you to make this newest body of work?
Yeah, there's touching on the personal and then also staying tapped into kind of what things are happening in popular culture. There's these reference to the Kendrick Lamar, Drake beef, and then it's just coincidental that my show is up during spooky season, if you will. So you'll see cloaked figures, as I'm calling them, in the work, and the cloaked figures really represent the masks we wear or the kind of different ways we mask or cloak to move through different situations. And that's not necessarily a negative. They're like forms of protection.
I think what's coming up for me is just wondering was there something specific that made you want to create this body of work, or is it just a general feeling about things that have been happening with you or things that you've been thinking about as of lately?
I think there's two specific relationships that triggered creating this body of work. One that we can call maybe a situationship, and then a relationship I have with myself. And I really had to dig into that relationship with myself and really to understand how I ended up in a situationship. Even that term just also being a very pop culture term, I feel like. But it also being a real way that folks move through relationship these days. There's a breakdown that's happening, and it doesn't feel good for the people on the receiving end of that. I just wanted to make work about it as a way to move through it, to let others know that it's happening around us and we all have an experience of being on the other side of it and working through it. I think it's easy to not see the good at the same time as the bad or the difficult is happening, right? So I think the work really is a kind of token of that actually happening, and come out with this thing that you feel really good about in terms of clarity, or just a symbol of, okay, I did that and I learned from it, and now we're going to just keep on pushing. Because you get to a certain point where you're like, I'm going to break that pattern of behavior for myself so that I can move on to the next lesson. And that doesn't mean everything's bright and rosy on the other side of it, because there's always these new life challenges that come up and people that come into your life to teach you new lessons about yourself and the bigger ideas of the world.
I completely agree with you. I think what's also interesting is to think about the way, on the one hand, the idea of creation and creating, and the idea of one being an artist and making something out of nothing. And so this pure flow of creativity that exists within all of us. And then on the other side, the questions that inevitably come up in one's life, like, why did this happen? Who am I as a person? What do I want? What are my values? All of that inquiry and all of those kinds of questions that are deeply personal. And each one of us is on that journey of discovery, whether we want to lean into that or not. Some people spend a significant time of their life trying to figure out those things and trying to really discover who they are with the time that we have, which is so finite. So it's interesting to hear you speaking about the personal and the questions and the situations and the relationships and the personal relationship one has to their self. And then on the other side, I'm thinking about just the way that you're thinking about all of those things through this visual language, and how you've developed that visual language, how you've just taken photography as a very important grounding point, as how you've taken the practice of collaging and building up of motifs and creating patterns in your work, and some of these very sort of visual aspects of the questions and the answers that you're trying to get to. Because I'd really love to turn the conversation to the works. Can we speak a little bit about your use of photography and your use of the self-portrait, and the ways in which you think about that as a tool and as a means of expression? And also maybe if we could dig deep into what would early on as you were becoming an artist, or just maybe deepening your practice as an artist, how did you get to the place of using photography, and more specifically your self-image, your portrait, as a very important basis or grounding for your work?
Yeah. So for this body of work specifically, I sourced images from all over. I didn't just specifically use vintage magazines. So that was really exciting. I felt a new freedom to go out in the world and take pictures. Throughout my practice, I've set rules and boundaries, and I tried to stay in between those. And then you get to a certain point and you create a new set of rules, or you let some of those walls down. But photography and using myself as the subject has been with me from a very early time. In my kind of early creation of work, I could think back to photographs of people. I would go to people's homes and photograph them in their homes, but also I would put myself in the photograph too, to think about this idea. Is like, is this where I belong? Are these my people? But also interested in someone's home. What are the things they surround themselves with to better make them feel safe, or allow others to see what they love and what they cherish?
I would love to know a little bit more about the motifs and patterns that you use, and the symbols that are throughout the works in this show. And there's also the repetitiveness, I think, of certain kinds of symbols that we see again and again, images of plant life, animal life, and just also the orientation of these objects and these things.
Back in January, I moved my studio to New York. All of the work was started, at least, if not finished, here in New York, in my New York studio. And there's a reference to that new place through maybe the brick patterns or the subway tile pattern. The wallpaper that I've used throughout my collage practice and beyond has always lived in that world of floral patterns and faux textures or faux material, if you will. So you might think you're looking at a tufted background, but it's a flat surface. It's this kind of illusion, which I think helps to talk about the things in the work itself. The early use of the symbol of a rose has lived throughout my practice. It's entered my work years ago when I lost my niece in a house fire. And I wanted to work through that loss, but also have a symbol for her existence in my work and in my life. And so her middle name is Rose. And so that just seemed like this obvious way to link her with me on my journey, even though she's not physically here.
Yeah, there's some pigeons in the work.
Oh,
I was like,
sorry.
that's very much a nod to New York.
Yes,
Right.
it's definitely a thank you. I was like, what are the animals? Introducing New York as a setting for this space, for where the works were set in, who the works might be speaking to, and yeah, a playful nod to these kind of key signifiers of New York.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's really just great to see how where you are and what's happening in this moment of your life is coming out in this work in such a straightforward way. Now let's maybe dig into some of the works. I know there were some that were pretty personal to you. Maybe we can start with Lucid Girl and talk a little bit about that piece. I want to just pull it up. So in Lucid Girl, we see a figure, which is yourself. We see your feet coming out underneath a cloth. There are certain interesting elements. There's what looks like a brick wallpaper, and you're set in behind a very lush sort of natural setting that looks like a countryside. Can we talk about what's happening in that work?
I think this work is a unique approach for me, a self-portrait. I wanted to make a piece where I was this cloaked figure. So I'm hiding from something in a way, but I'm hiding myself as I work through. There's a big blue tear coming down the cloaked figure's eye, and the color of that teardrop is the same color of the entire space that you walk into to view the work. The concept is literally that I've zoomed the viewer in on the tear, so you almost walk inside the tear to view the show.
Oh, wow.
These kind of specific references to being from small town Massachusetts, which may be the countryside looking background represent, and then the brick or tiled paper on either side represents the work being made in New York. There's definitely a nod to these kind of funny but real things. More specifically, the figure appears to be hovering.
Yes.
Which I wanted to create this kind of, not to symbolize that I often ghosts are thought of as someone who is no longer here. And I think that's one way to look at it. But I think as our souls or our beings move through experiences, so that kind of floating figure is almost to represent that moving through something or moving past it.
I want to talk a little bit about But Are You Kinfolk?
Mm-hmm.
I just love the title of that work. There's two of them. One that has strawberries all over it and like those little dollies. And the other is also what looks like a floral wallpaper with roses again, a nod to your niece. But I love the way some of the words and the letters are hidden underneath like these fragile little beautiful flowers. But the question itself seems very deep and loaded. Because I'm definitely thinking of your skin folk, but are you kinfolk, right? Let's talk about that.
Like you said, it's in response to that saying, not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? Are you kinfolk?
Yeah.
And it's almost similar to having a literal mirror in the show, right? It's speaking to you once you face it. So often I'll have mirrors in the work to remind the viewer that like this is not just about me, right? This is also something to do with you have to unpack your experience in the bigger story.
Yeah, I think that's also what's really interesting. The idea that one, this piece in particular, these two works can act as mirrors. And also the idea that there are so many subtle and overt ways in which you can allow someone to feel as though they are participating in a show. And I think that this is such a nice choice. A question is such a direct prompt, and it conjures up so many, because it's a question that requires by nature with a question mark a response. I think that what it immediately will trigger is one asking themselves, are they, or even asking, what does this mean?
Right.
And that further thinking and that further consideration, I would say it's a really nice way to draw people in.
Yeah, I think I also, some folks did ask me like, what does that even mean? And it's like also a cultural thing, which was, at first I was like, what do you mean? You don't know what that means. Like when the work opens up or it's clarity on those bigger topics too. These things that feel very familiar and everyday are new to others.
Yeah. So the show is on view for a little over a week, about another week and a half. All the folks listening, Genevieve Gaignard's show, Thinking Out Loud, is on view now until November 9th at Wilmington, Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Genevieve, for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I really loved chatting with you today.
Thank you.
That was my episode with Genevieve Gaignard. I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to Genevieve for joining me on the show. And it's a wrap, folks. That was our episode of Everything is Connected, conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes are recorded remotely and on location wherever in the world I find myself, whether that be the US, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and more. Depending on where I am at the time of these recordings, you will hear the sights and the sounds of my local environment. I look forward to continuing these wonderful conversations with artists and creative professionals across industries with you. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.